I've seen a couple of things in the news recently that made me think to my first blog post and why I started this in the first place. Uh, Over the past couple of days, Premier League footballers Wilfried Zaha and David McGoldrick have shared racist tweets that they've received from football fans, and the content of them is about as foul and abusive as you can imagine. And it's been revealed that the person behind the tweet to Wilfried Zaha was actually a 12-year-old boy who's now been arrested for it. And people have been talking again about the problem with racism in football, and it's starting to be spoken that it's not actually a problem in football, but just a problem in society as a whole. And it's astonishing that a 12-year-old has been programmed to think like this at such a young age. I think it's too lazy to blame football. John Barnes summed it up well when he said, 12-year-old boy who racially abused Zaha online is also a victim of society who showed and continued to show them that black people are inferior. Where did he learn this? We're being made to think that it's on the football terraces. We have to start addressing the real problem. And the point is that football is just part of a society that has a deep-rooted problem with institutional racism. And just like a disease, it spreads into every aspect of our lives. So that's education, class, crime, and everything else, as well as football. Ian Wright said, people like to make these experiences seem like it's not the norm for black people. It's always an outlier, not one of us, not a real insert club fan. These are real people and daily experiences. Sooner we accept it, the better we can deal with it. We stand with you, Wilf. For me, this abuse and mindset is just too frequent for us to call exceptions. It is an epidemic that we have not been taking seriously for too long a time. Thinking about this 12-year-old boy, I hope he was just an ignorant kid who made some comments that he's now going to regret and he didn't really mean, and he didn't really know the effects of them. But it's disturbing to wonder what this kid has seen in his 12 years or experienced in his life that has made him think that this is okay. He has been let down by society, and it is our duty as society to fix this so that in 12 years' time, people who are born today aren't getting arrested for the same thing. Moving on from football, the second piece of news that I saw was the results of a study conducted last year, 2019, which you can find if you search the words Oxford's Centre for Social Investigation, Hard Working on the internet. So if you just type into Google or Bing the words Oxford's Centre for Social Investigation, Hard Working, it should come up. But if you still can't find it, let me know and I'll send you a message. And the studies show that 38% of people in the UK thought that some races or ethnic groups are born less hardworking. So that's about 2 out of 5 people in this country last year that admitted believing that people are born lazy depending on their race or ethnicity, which is pretty conclusive evidence that racism is a problem in this country at some level, at least for even the biggest skeptics. And it brings me back to my original point that I wanted to go back to my first blog post and the reason I posted it. And it's because I was discussing racism in the UK on Twitter with some friends and people that I didn't know. And it soon became apparent that it was a pointless exercise because nobody can get their point across in 280 characters on the internet, especially for something so complex as racism. And I found it really frustrating. So I wanted to go away and put together some evidence backing up my point. And I ended up learning so much myself that I wanted to share it with others. And the first post I made was a written article, which was mainly copy and pasted extracts that I put together and highlighted from people who know more about the matter than myself. And I think it could be beneficial because it was for me. The post was titled, "What is institutional racism and is it currently present in the UK?" I used 2 main pieces of evidence to look into this. The first of which was the MacPherson Report, which was one of the most thorough reports into systemic racism in the UK, and it was the inquiry into the murder of Stephen Lawrence, a young black man who was murdered in a racially motivated attack in the early 90s. And the report concluded that there was a culture of inherent racism in the police as well as society as a whole in the UK. There was a recent 3-part documentary on the BBC about the murder and its aftermath, and that's available on iPlayer if you want to look into it a bit more. So part of the inquiry's objective was to establish a definition of institutional racism, and whilst it struggled to find an absolute definition, it arrived at one workable for the purposes of the inquiry, but said that it should not be treated as cast in stone, and it was. The collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racist stereotyping which disadvantage minority ethnic people. It persists because of the failure of the organisation openly and adequately to recognise and address its existence and causes by policy, example and leadership. Without recognition and action to eliminate such racism, it can prevail as part of the ethos or culture of the organisation. It is a corrosive disease. So I'm just going to talk about a few things that were established in the report, but it only scratches the surface, so I would still recommend looking into a bit more detail yourself if you have time, because it really helped me understand how deep rooted the issue was, and I personally found it really beneficial. So Stephen Lawrence was stabbed to death in April 1993 in an incident that was undoubtedly racially motivated and involved 5 or 6 white male youths. The police investigation following the crime was found to be a sequence of disasters and disappointments. The MPS have been roundly criticised in both the Kent and MacPherson reports, and they accept that their investigation of the murder was palpably flawed. The underlying cause of the police failure has been found to be not purely incompetence, but institutionalised racism. So it suggests that the blame shouldn't be laid at individuals, but the collective failure of the police to be impartial as a whole. And friends and family of Stephen were deemed to be treated badly due to their skin colour, and the police didn't give the murder the attention that they would have done if Stephen was white, let alone white and killed in a racially motivated attack. The inquiry was first called for in 1997 and produced in 1999, 6 years on from the death of Stephen, and it is estimated that it had taken more than 100,000 pages of reports, statements and other written or printed documents, and concluded that the Metropolitan Police Service investigation had been incompetent and the officers had committed fundamental errors. The report also found that the Met Police was institutionally racist. A total of 70 recommendations for reform were made, covering both policing and criminal law. These proposals included abolishing the double jeopardy rule and criminalising racist statements made in private. The report also called for reform in the British Civil Service, local governments, the National Health Service, schools, and to address issues of institutional racism. This was a comprehensive, fair and balanced report that gave the UK undeniable proof that there was a deep-rooted issue with racism, both conscious and, arguably more importantly, unconscious, and that this was given to us in 1999. The second piece of evidence in the blog post was a follow-up investigation produced by Professor Gus John, or Gustin John, in 2019 to see whether the recommendations that were given by the report were successfully implemented. And I'm going to read some snippets from his post. In 2002 to 2003, I was commissioned by the Home Office to evaluate the training and what my team and I found as we went from police area to police area, observing training being delivered and interviewing senior police officers was truly shocking. Most officers resented being compelled to attend the training and set about making life hell for the trainers. The response of police commanders and chief constables to such conduct by their officers was mixed. Some were as appalled as I was and pledged to do something about it. Others pleaded that conduct was to be expected. One assistant chief constable telling a chief inspector who was passionate about police and community relations that this area of policing was a career graveyard, and that someone as bright and ambitious as he was should avoid it at all costs if he wanted to rise up the ranks. Crucially, however, none of the police forces had put in place measures for assessing the extent to which the training their officers were receiving was having any impact on their operational performance or decision making. Astonishingly, discussing the mandatory nature of the training, some senior officers protested that they could not see what relevance such training had for their firearm officers or their whole highway patrol officers. The overall conclusion I reached was that the entire nationwide training operation was a costly and wasteful exercise. The institutional racism in the police cannot be separated from the structural racism of the state, as manifested in its immigration laws, border control practices, civil service, its failure to tackle the legacy of empire through schooling and education, and its failure to guarantee black people's rights by ensuring compliance with anti-discrimination legislation. The list could go on. In other words, the state exemplifies the failure to understand how structural, cultural, institutional and personal forms of racism and discrimination intersect and manifest in black people's experience of everyday life. Normalization, and 50 years after activists like myself campaigned about police carrying out fishing expeditions to find suspected illegal immigrants, it has been normalised that the police round up the Windrush generation who have lived here for more than 50 years and cart them off to Yarl's Wood to await deportation and a woeful existence until death. So let us not make MacPherson's institutional racism our measure of the progress we have made since the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. In this regard, it would be negligent and dishonest not to mention that MacPherson led that inquiry because of the collusion of the police with the visceral racism of Stephen's murderers. This is something which highlighted the fact that they, the police, were on the same spectrum as those racist murderers. One innocent young man lay dead, and his murderers were strutting around the place as if they were invincible, only because the police failed to do their duty by Stephen and his family. So those words there weren't, they weren't from me. They were from an expert. And if you listen to Professor John's Wikipedia description of himself, it's hard to think of a better person placed to assess this. Augustin John, born 11th of March 1945, is a Grenadian-born award-winning writer, education campaigner, consultant, lecturer and researcher who moved to the UK in 1964. He has done notable work in the fields of education policy, management and international development. As a social analyst, he specialises in social audits, change management, policy formulation and review, and programme evaluation and development. Since the 1960s, he has been active in issues of education and schooling in Britain's inner cities such as Manchester, Birmingham and London, and he was the first black director of education and leisure services in Britain. He has also worked in a number of university settings, including as visiting faculty professor of education at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, as an associate professor of education and honorary fellow of the London Centre for Leadership in Learning at the UCL Institution of Education, University of London, and visiting professor at Coventry University. A respected public speaker and media commentator, he works internationally as an executive coach and a management and social investment consultant. So how can everyday Joes possibly say that institutional racism does not exist in the UK when someone is perfectly suited as Professor Gus John has dedicated his life to making the world a better place and has produced almost unarguable evidence that it does exist? And I really encourage people to read into that a bit further, because they will be able to offer you more proof than I do. But my own findings is that we need to accept and acknowledge the racism built into the core of the foundations of this country, and we need to find a way to see that it's okay to accept that we have unconscious racism without having to suffer from intense burden of guilt. And we need to be able to see the potential that the acceptance of our racism has to help eradicate it. And once we've done that, we can maybe work together to try and get rid of it, or at least reduce it to its lowest possible level.